There are places on this earth where the stone itself seems to speak a language we have not yet learned to read. Not because the rock is unusual, not because the landscape is particularly sacred or the climate uniquely preserving, but because of what human hands did with that stone, in many cases thousands of years before any tool we consider sophisticated had been invented, and in ways that continue to raise genuine, unanswered questions among archaeologists, engineers, architects, and historians who have devoted serious careers to studying them. Walk through the right doorway in coastal Peru, and you find yourself standing beside walls of enormous, irregular stone blocks fitted together so tightly that a playing card cannot find purchase between the joints. Blocks weighing tens of thousands of kilograms, shaped into polygons with 15 or 20 individual faces, each face carved to match the geometry of the neighboring stone with a precision that modern engineers find difficult to achieve with power tools. Travel to the high desert plateau of Bolivia and you encounter stone surfaces ground flat to tolerances measurable in fractions of a millimeter. Interior channels and drill holes arranged with a uniformity that looks, to untrained eyes, almost industrial. Descend into the bedrock of a Maltese hillside, and you find yourself in carved limestone chambers whose acoustic properties, when properly tested, produce resonant effects that match the results of purpose-built anechoic chambers in modern research facilities. Archaeology has always been a discipline of productive uncertainty. Researchers gather evidence, form hypotheses, test them against new data, and revise their conclusions. It is a process that is inherently incomplete because the past does not leave comprehensive records. Most organic materials rot. Most written accounts were never made. Most of what ancient people knew about their own practices was embedded in living craft traditions and passed from hand to hand, not written in texts or stored in archives. When those traditions ended, through conquest, through climate change, through disease or migration, or the simple passage of generations, the knowledge went with them, leaving only the stone. And the stone, as we have already noted, does not always explain itself. This documentary is built on a conviction that the most honest approach to the ancient world is one that holds two ideas simultaneously. The first is that ancient people were fully human, as intelligent, as innovative, as organizationally sophisticated as any civilization that followed them, capable of remarkable intellectual and practical achievements that we are still trying to understand. The second is that specific aspects of their greatest construction achievements genuinely remain unexplained to a degree that invites serious inquiry, not because the explanations are supernatural, but because the evidence necessary to reconstruct the full picture has not yet been found or has not yet been adequately assembled. The question that will follow us through this documentary is not new. Historians and engineers have asked it in various forms for centuries. But it remains relevant because it has not been definitively answered. The question is, what did ancient builders know? Not in the vague sense of how clever were they, but in the specific technical sense of what knowledge, what principles of surveying, of materials science, of logistics, of geometry, of astronomy, allowed them to produce the things they produced at the scale and precision they achieved. And how did they come to possess that knowledge, encode it and transmit it across the generations that sustained these extraordinary building traditions? Those questions will not be fully answered here. They cannot be. The evidence does not yet support final answers. But the asking of them, across 10 extraordinary sites, leads us through some of the most remarkable places human ambition has ever expressed itself in stone. And in that journey, the outlines of something important begin to emerge. Not a solution, but a more precise understanding of the problem. Not a resolved mystery, but a better articulated one. It is worth pausing here to consider what we mean when we describe a mystery as unresolved. We do not mean that the sites we are about to examine defy all explanation, or that mainstream archaeology has nothing credible to say about them. In every case, researchers have proposed plausible frameworks for understanding how and why these structures were built, and in most cases, those frameworks are substantially supported by physical evidence. What we mean, more precisely, is that the gap between the plausible framework and the confirmed detail remains significant, that the explanations work in outline, but not always in specifics, and that the specific questions that remain are often the most technically and intellectually interesting ones. It is in that gap, between the general explanation and the particular mechanism, that the best science is still being done. We begin in a place that most people have never heard of, at an altitude where the air is thin and the stone is extraordinarily hard, and where someone long ago decided to do something with that stone that our best current explanations still struggle to account for fully. At an elevation of nearly 3,900 meters above sea level, on a broad altiplano plateau in western Bolivia, the site known as Puma Punku occupies a landscape that seems at first glance to offer little reason for it to exist. The air is cold and thin. The ground is dry and wind-scoured. The nearest major water source, Lake Titicaca, shimmers on the horizon. And in the middle of this austere terrain, half buried by sediment and partially dismantled by centuries of stone scavenging, lies a collection of worked stone blocks that have generated more genuine engineering discussion than almost any other site in the Americas. Puma Punku is part of the larger Tiwanaku archaeological complex associated with the Tiwanaku culture that reached its peak somewhere between 500 and 1000 CE, though earlier construction phases at the site may push that chronology significantly further back. The Tiwanaku were not a primitive culture. They were sophisticated agriculturalists who developed raised field farming techniques that allowed them to cultivate crops at altitudes most civilizations would consider unsuitable for agriculture. They maintained long-distance trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers. They built large urban centers and produced elaborate ceramic and textile traditions. They were, by any reasonable measure, an accomplished and complex civilization. What they did at Puma Punku, however, stretches the conventional picture of Andean pre-Columbian technology in ways that continue to generate debate. The site appears to have been a large ceremonial platform. Its construction used two primary stone types: red sandstone, which appears in very large blocks, some estimated at over 100 metric tons, and gray andesite, which occurs in smaller but far more complex pieces. It is the andesite that draws the most sustained attention from researchers because the forms into which it was cut are genuinely extraordinary. The surface quality of many Puma Punku andesite blocks is the first thing that strikes investigators familiar with ancient stonework. The flat surfaces of certain blocks have been measured and found to deviate from perfect planarity by fractions of a millimeter across dimensions of a meter or more. This is not the rough, hand-dressed surface typical of ancient construction. It is a quality that, when described to engineers without reference to its origin, prompts comparisons with precision-ground modern stonework. Beyond the flat surfaces, certain blocks feature extremely complex three-dimensional profiles. Some have H-shaped cross-sections when viewed end-on. Others feature interior channels and recesses cut at precise right angles, with clean, sharp internal corners that are difficult to achieve without something functionally equivalent to a chisel, guided along a perfectly straight edge. Several blocks have series of circular holes drilled along their length at regular measured intervals, holes whose spacing is consistent within fractions of a centimeter across the full series. The mainstream explanation for how these forms were achieved centers on stone-on-stone abrasion and careful use of harder stone tools for shaping. Ancient craftspeople using similar techniques in other cultures, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the ancient Maya, achieved impressive precision. And there is no theoretical reason why sustained, skilled effort using stone abrasives could not produce the surface quality seen at Puma Punku. The question is not whether these methods could work. It is whether they fully account for every detail of what is observed. One specific complication involves the interior corners. Creating a precise right-angled internal corner in hard stone using abrasion-based techniques is significantly harder than creating flat surfaces or even curved ones. Abrasive tools naturally round corners rather than sharpen them. Achieving a sharp, clean interior corner requires a cutting action, either a chisel-type tool that removes material cleanly, or a sequence of cuts carefully made with a flat tool held at precise angles. Whether the tools available to the Tiwanaku allowed for this kind of precision cutting at the scale and consistency seen at Puma Punku is debated among researchers who have examined the blocks directly. Another complication is the sourcing of the andesite. The nearest identified geological source for the specific type of andesite used at Puma Punku is the Copacabana Peninsula on the far side of Lake Titicaca, approximately 90 kilometers away by the most direct water route. Moving multi-ton blocks across that distance using pre-Columbian technology is not impossible in principle. Reed boats of the type still built on Lake Titicaca today are capable of carrying substantial loads, and transport by water is generally easier than overland movement. But the organizational challenge of moving many tons of stone across that distance, arriving with sufficient precision and care to preserve the quality of material that would be needed for the work done at the site, remains a logistical puzzle without a fully demonstrated solution. Researchers have proposed that the Tiwanaku used standardized measuring templates, likely made from wood or fiber, to guide the cutting of complex forms. This is consistent with what we know of other ancient precision traditions, where complex shapes were reproduced through template-guided work rather than measurement from first principles each time. If such templates existed, they would have allowed craftspeople to produce identical or complementary profiles across multiple blocks, which would explain the consistent geometry observed. That these templates have not survived is unsurprising given their perishable nature, but their absence means the explanation remains inferential rather than confirmed. One additional feature of certain Puma Punku blocks has attracted comment: what appear to be precise countersunk indentations designed to accept some kind of joining mechanism, possibly metal staples or clamps, which were used elsewhere in Andean construction to lock stone blocks together against seismic movement. If these indentations were indeed designed for metal joiners, it would suggest a level of pre-planning and precision measurement that goes beyond improvised assembly, implying instead that the blocks were manufactured to specific tolerances, intended to work together in a predetermined configuration. There is a further dimension to the Puma Punku puzzle that researchers have only recently begun to examine systematically: the question of site layout. The individual blocks at Puma Punku, despite the fact that the structure was severely disrupted long ago, possibly by an earthquake, possibly by deliberate dismantling during the Spanish colonial period, show evidence of a deliberate spatial arrangement when their original positions are reconstructed. The interlocking profiles of certain blocks suggest they were designed to fit together into a composite structure with a specific overall geometry. If this is correct, then the builders were not simply producing impressive individual pieces. They were producing components of a larger designed system, each piece manufactured to tolerances that allowed precise assembly into a coordinated whole. That level of design coherence, applied to stone components of this complexity and scale, implies a planning and coordination capacity that goes well beyond improvised construction. Some researchers have also noted similarities between certain Puma Punku construction techniques and those used at other Tiwanaku sites, suggesting that the precision stonework at Puma Punku represents the apex of a broader tradition rather than an isolated anomaly. If so, the full scope of Tiwanaku stone technology may be considerably more extensive than the most dramatic examples at Puma Punku suggest. Ongoing excavation at the Tiwanaku site complex continues to reveal new elements, and future investigation may yet clarify how the most challenging construction features were achieved. The full picture of Puma Punku remains incomplete. What is beyond dispute is that the site represents an extraordinary investment of skilled labor and material, producing stone forms of unusual precision at an altitude and in a context where the logistical challenges were formidable. Exactly how every element of that production was achieved remains, in the most technically specific sense, a question that current evidence has not fully answered. Not every megalithic mystery announces itself with dramatic scale. Some arrive quietly, objects sitting in the open air, looking at first like natural formations, revealing their strangeness only on closer examination. The stone spheres of Costa Rica are that kind of mystery. They do not tower over the landscape. They do not require craning the neck to see the top. They simply rest in the earth, smooth and silent, and the longer one examines them, the harder they are to fully explain. The spheres began coming to light in the 1930s, when United Fruit Company workers clearing jungle for banana plantations in the Diquis Delta region of southern Costa Rica started encountering large stone balls, partially buried in the soil. The initial discoveries were treated as curiosities, but as more spheres emerged, dozens, then hundreds, scattered across a region encompassing river terraces, islands, and the jungle floor, it became clear that something systematic had occurred here, something deliberate and culturally significant. The spheres are now attributed to the pre-Columbian Diquis culture, which inhabited the region roughly between 700 and 1530 CE, though some researchers suggest earlier origins for certain examples. In 2014, they were inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List as the pre-Columbian chiefdom settlements with stone spheres of the Diquis. The physical facts of the spheres are straightforward to state and genuinely difficult to explain. They range from a few centimeters to over 2 meters in diameter. The largest examples weigh upward of 15 metric tons. They are made from granodiorite, a very hard igneous rock related to granite, quarried from the Talamanca mountain foothills, some distance from the delta where most spheres are found. And they are, by measurement, remarkably spherical. Careful geometric analysis of the better preserved examples finds that deviations from perfect sphericity, even in the largest specimens, are typically less than half of 1% across the entire surface. To appreciate what that means in practice, consider that the largest spheres have a diameter of roughly 2 meters, meaning their circumference is approximately 6 meters. A deviation of 0.5% from perfect sphericity across that full circumference translates to an error of about 3 centimeters at most. In an object weighing 15 tons, shaped by hand using stone tools without any mechanical guidance system, that level of precision is not something that happens accidentally. It is the result of sustained, deliberate effort directed toward a specific geometric goal. The mainstream interpretation frames the spheres as prestige objects, markers of chiefly power and social status. Several lines of evidence support this. Many spheres were found in spatial arrangements near elite residential structures, suggesting deliberate placement as displays of status and possibly boundary markers. The investment of labor required to produce them, particularly the largest examples, would have been significant, making them credible symbols of the productive capacity commanded by a powerful chief. Similar logic has been applied to labor-intensive prestige objects in many other ancient cultures, from jade axes in Neolithic Europe to massive carved stone thrones in Mesoamerica. The complication is the precision question, and it is a meaningful one. If the spheres served a purely symbolic function, impressing viewers, demonstrating organizational power, marking territory, then approximate sphericity would have served equally well. A sphere that looks round to the unaided eye does not need to be geometrically precise to within 0.5%. The additional effort required to push beyond impressively round to geometrically near perfect raises a question that the prestige object explanation does not fully address. What motivated that extra work? Several possibilities have been proposed. One is that the craftspeople who made the spheres were operating within a tradition of craft excellence in which near perfection was its own goal, the same impulse that drives master craftspeople in many traditions to exceed what the practical function of their work would require. Another possibility is that the precision itself was the point, that the spheres were understood as embodiments of mathematical or cosmological perfection, and that achieving true sphericity was a sacred obligation rather than a practical one. A third, less explored suggestion is that the spheres may have had functional uses we have not identified, where precision mattered for reasons not yet apparent. The displacement of many spheres from their original positions has significantly complicated archaeological analysis. When Spanish colonizers arrived, folklore about gold hidden inside the spheres led to widespread destruction. Many were broken open and found to contain nothing. Others were moved, sometimes over considerable distances, to serve as decorations at official buildings, private homes, and public spaces, stripping them of any contextual information that might have helped researchers understand their original arrangement and purpose. Only a small number remain in documented original positions. The few spheres still in their original settings have yielded some tantalizing but inconclusive observations. Certain groupings appear to correspond to astronomical directions. Some arrangements seem to echo the proportions of constellations visible in the regional night sky, though researchers debate whether these correspondences are real or coincidental. The absence of a comprehensive original survey map makes it impossible to evaluate the full pattern. The cultural context in which the spheres were made provides some additional clues, even if it does not resolve the central questions. The Diki society was organized as a series of chiefdoms, hierarchical political units in which a paramount chief commanded the labor and resources of subordinate communities. The prestige economy of such societies often involved the competitive production and display of objects that demonstrated the chief's ability to mobilize skilled labor. Stone spheres produced by specialist craftspeople working under chiefly patronage would have served as potent embodiments of that capacity. The larger and more perfect the sphere, the more powerfully it testified to the chief's command over human skill and effort. But this social logic, while consistent with the sphere's existence, still does not explain the specific degree of precision achieved. Prestige economics can explain why spheres were made and why they were large. It does not explain why they were geometrically near perfect to within measurable tolerances. The extra effort required to go from impressively round to mathematically precise is real, and the social return on that extra effort, compared to a sphere that simply looks round, is not obvious. Unless, of course, the precision itself was understood as a form of spiritual or cosmological accomplishment, in which case the additional effort may have been directed not at impressing human observers, but at satisfying a different kind of standard entirely. What the stone spheres of Costa Rica ultimately leave us with is a puzzle about motivation as much as method. The technical challenge of their production is real but probably soluble with sufficient skilled labor and time. The deeper question of why that level of precision was considered worth achieving and what it meant to the people who made these objects is one that the available evidence cannot yet answer. Somewhere in the jungle of southern Costa Rica, 15-ton spheres of near-perfect geometry rest in the earth, waiting for an explanation that fully accounts for them. There is a monument, standing at the base of the outer walls of Sacsayhuaman and looking upward, when the scale of what the Inca achieved becomes physically, viscerally present in a way that photographs and descriptions do not convey. The stones above you are not building blocks in any normal sense of the word. They are boulders, massive, irregular, many-faced slabs of limestone and diorite that rise in staggered zigzag terraces up the hillside, some of them so large that the human figures clustered around their bases look like afterthoughts, and every one of them fits against its neighbors with a tightness that has been measured, examined, and marveled at by engineers for generations. Sacsayhuaman occupies a commanding hillside position above the ancient Inca capital of Cusco in the highlands of southern Peru. Its construction is traditionally dated to the reign of the Inca emperor Pachacuti and his successors, beginning in the mid-15th century CE, though some researchers argue that earlier phases of construction at the site may predate the Inca period. The Inca themselves, in accounts recorded by Spanish chroniclers shortly after the conquest, described the building of Sacsayhuaman as one of the supreme achievements of their civilization, a project organized through the Mita labor system that mobilized tens of thousands of workers from across the empire over a period of decades. The emita was a form of labor tax, a requirement for adult men throughout the empire to contribute periodic rotations of labor to state construction projects. It was a profoundly effective organizational tool. Through it, the Inca state could mobilize tens of thousands of workers simultaneously, rotating them in and out of service ensuring a steady supply of labor for projects that required sustained effort over years. At Sacsayhuaman, this system was applied to one of the most demanding stone construction challenges ever undertaken in the Americas. The outermost terrace of Sacsayhuaman is the most dramatic. It is built from the largest individual stones at the site, with some blocks in the lower courses measuring over 8 meters in height, 6 meters in width, and estimated weights exceeding 100 tons. These are not stones that yield easily to any technology. The quarry sites from which they were extracted are located several kilometers from the construction site, across varied terrain that includes river crossings and significant elevation changes. The transport of such masses, using ropes, wooden rollers, earthen ramps, and the organized effort of large numbers of workers, is documented in Inca historical accounts and supported by archaeological evidence of quarry sites with partially extracted blocks still in place. Experimental archaeology has confirmed that large block transport using these methods is physically possible. Groups of researchers and volunteers have moved multi-ton blocks using teams of workers, wooden sledges, and earthen ramps, demonstrating that the principle is sound even if scaling from experimental blocks of a few tons to actual Sacsayhuaman blocks of over 100 tons involves challenges that have not been fully replicated. The organizational requirement, maintaining the coordination, communication, and sustained effort necessary to move many such blocks to a precise destination, represents a level of project management sophistication that is in itself remarkable. But transport, challenging as it is only part of what makes Sacsayhuaman notable. The other part is the fitting. The stones at Sacsayhuaman are not rectangular. They are not dressed to a uniform shape that allows for standardized placement. They are polygonal, irregular, multi-faced, each one unique in its geometry, and they are fitted against each other with a precision that requires explanation. The joint quality at Sacsayhuaman varies somewhat across different sections of the wall, with the most carefully fitted blocks concentrated in the lower, older courses, and somewhat rougher work in areas that may have been constructed more quickly or with less experienced labor. But in the best sections, the joints are extraordinary. Curved surfaces in 3 dimensions meeting with no gap, irregular faces conforming precisely to the geometry of adjacent stones, internal angles matching so closely that the wall behaves under load and seismic stress as a nearly monolithic mass. Researchers who have examined the fitting in detail have generally converged on a process of iterative trial fitting, a method in which each new stone is lowered into rough position. The contact points are identified by the marks left on both surfaces, material is removed from the high spots, and the process is repeated until the fit is satisfactory. Given tools that can cut and abrade limestone, this process is feasible. Given sufficient time, skilled workers, and the organizational capacity to maintain the workflow, even the most demanding joints could be achieved by this method. What makes this explanation impressive rather than merely obvious is the scale at which it was sustained. Not one stone fitted once, not 10 or 20. Hundreds of enormous, irregularly shaped blocks, each requiring multiple iterations of the fitting process, each requiring that a team of workers lift a multi-ton stone, adjust it, lower it, evaluate it, lift it again, and so on. Across hundreds of meters of wall, simultaneously managing the introduction of new blocks from the quarry and the progression of completed sections. The cognitive and organizational demands of maintaining quality control across an operation of this size using this method are not trivial. The seismic performance of Sacsayhuaman adds a dimension that has attracted particular attention from structural engineers. The 1950 earthquake that devastated Cusco, destroying colonial-era buildings throughout the city, left the Inca stonework of Sacsayhuaman essentially undamaged. This is not an isolated observation. Throughout the seismically active Andes, Inca polygonal stonework has consistently outperformed later construction in earthquakes. The mechanism appears to be the irregular, interlocking joint geometry. Under seismic loading, the stones shift slightly and then resettle, distributing the energy across a large number of irregular surfaces rather than concentrating it at the straight joints of rectangular masonry, which tend to crack and fail catastrophically under the same conditions. Whether the Inca designed this property into their wall systems deliberately, whether they understood in some functional or intuitive sense that polygonal interlocking masonry resisted earthquakes better than regular coursed masonry, or whether it was an emergent discovery gradually incorporated into their building tradition, because structures built this way demonstrably survived while others failed, is debated. Either interpretation implies a sophisticated relationship with seismic risk that went well beyond what the structural engineering of most contemporary civilizations achieved. It also raises the possibility that the Incas' seemingly counterintuitive choice to invest enormous effort in irregular fitting, rather than the simpler work of rectangular block laying, was a deliberate technical decision as much as an aesthetic one. There is a further layer to the Sacsayhuaman story that deserves attention: the question of what the structure was originally designed to be. Early Spanish accounts described it as a fortress, and the site has been referred to as such in popular literature ever since. But most contemporary researchers believe the fortress label is a significant oversimplification. The zigzag wall system, while it would have had some defensive utility in certain scenarios, appears to have been primarily a feature of the ceremonial landscape around Cusco, part of a larger sacred geography in which certain hills, water sources, and alignments played cosmologically significant roles. The shape of the walls, viewed from the air, traces a pattern that some researchers have interpreted as representing the teeth or the head of a puma. And the city of Cusco itself, according to several colonial accounts drawing on Inca oral tradition, was deliberately planned in the spatial outline of a puma, with Sacsayhuaman positioned as the head of the animal. Whether this cosmological interpretation was the primary organizing principle of the design, or a secondary layer of symbolism applied to a structure built for other reasons, is debated. But it reflects the broader Inca practice of encoding cultural meaning directly into the physical form of their most significant construction. The Inca tradition of working stone also carried a spiritual dimension that modern engineering analysis tends to set aside, but that shaped every aspect of how and why the buildings were made. Certain stones were understood to possess inherent spiritual power, and the act of shaping and placing them was ritualized in ways that governed the pace, the sequence, and the conduct of the work. Within this framework, the tightness of a stone joint was not merely structurally effective. It was, in some deeper cultural sense, a reflection of the quality of the relationship between the stones and between the people who placed them. The precision of Sacsayhuaman was not just engineering. It was, by the terms of the culture that produced it, a form of devotion. The sites we have examined so far are separated by thousands of kilometers and hundreds of years. They belong to entirely different cultural traditions: the Tiwanaku of the Bolivian Altiplano, the Diquis of coastal Costa Rica, the Inca of the Peruvian highlands. There is no documented evidence of contact between these cultures at the relevant historical periods. And yet, across all three, we encounter the same cluster of qualities: extreme precision of working, investment of effort beyond what practical function seems to require, and a relationship with stone that treats it not as a raw material to be shaped roughly, but as a medium to be mastered at its limits. That convergence does not prove anything specific, but it is the kind of convergence that makes the central question of this documentary more insistent. What knowledge allowed ancient builders, independently and across vast distances, to arrive at the limits of what stone can be persuaded to do? Any documentary about ancient megalithic construction will eventually arrive at Giza. The Great Pyramid is the most studied ancient structure in the world. More books written about it, more theories proposed for it, more scientific instruments pointed at it than perhaps any other building that has ever existed. And yet, precisely because it has been studied so exhaustively, the specific gaps in our understanding of how it was built are well mapped and well documented. We know where the evidence ends, we know where the interpretations begin, and we know which questions remain genuinely open despite centuries of investigation. The basic historical facts of the Great Pyramid are not in serious dispute. It was commissioned as a funerary monument for the pharaoh Khufu, fourth ruler of Egypt's fourth dynasty, around 2560 BCE. It was built by a highly organized state workforce, not slaves, as was believed for centuries, but a combination of skilled permanent craftspeople and rotating laborers recruited through a systematic national tax system. Archaeological excavations at Giza over the past several decades have revealed workers' villages with sophisticated infrastructure. Bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, administrative buildings, and the physical remains of the thousands of people who lived and worked at the site over the decades of construction. This is not a structure built by an oppressed population working under duress. It is a monument built by an organized, fed, and medically supported workforce serving a state project of paramount importance. The numbers associated with the pyramid are genuinely staggering. An estimated 2.3 million stone blocks were incorporated into the structure. The average block weight is approximately 2.5 to 3 metric tons, though this average is misleading because it masks a wide range. Most of the pyramid's limestone casing and core blocks fall in the range of 2 to 15 tons, while the granite elements deep inside the structure reach 25 to 80 tons per piece. The structure originally stood approximately 146 meters tall. Its base covers over 53,000 square meters, and it was completed within the approximately 23-year reign of Khufu, implying an average installation rate of roughly 340 blocks per day, every day for over 2 decades. The logistics of that production rate have been the subject of extensive engineering analysis. Researchers generally conclude that it is achievable given the organizational resources of Old Kingdom Egypt, using a combination of quarrying, water transport along the Nile, and overland movement using sledges on prepared surfaces. The discovery of a papyrus at Wadi al-Jarf, the oldest papyrus ever found in Egypt, provides direct evidence of this process, describing the transport of limestone blocks from Tura to Giza by a team of workers under the inspector Mera, who maintained detailed daily logs of the operation. This document is one of the most important finds in the history of pyramid research because it confirms, in contemporary written form, the broad outlines of the block transport method that researchers had reconstructed from physical evidence. What the Wadi al-Jarf papyrus does not resolve, and what remains one of the genuinely open questions at Giza, is the construction of the internal chambers and their installation sequence. The King's Chamber, at the heart of the pyramid, is built entirely from Aswan granite quarried approximately 900 kilometers south of Giza, transported north by boat along the Nile, and somehow maneuvered into position deep within a structure that was being constructed simultaneously around it. The chamber's ceiling consists of 9 massive granite slabs, weighing between 25 and 80 tons each. Above them, a series of 5 progressive spaces, called relieving chambers, are each capped by additional granite beams designed to distribute the colossal weight of the pyramid above the room and prevent the ceiling from being crushed. The engineering intelligence of this design is clear and impressive. The system works. The King's Chamber ceiling has remained intact for 45 centuries, but the process of installing those ceiling slabs in their precise positions, inside a structure being built upward around them, using the access routes available within the pyramid, has not been reconstructed in a way that accounts for every constraint. The Grand Gallery, a high corbelled passage ascending at a steep angle through the interior, has been proposed as a kind of internal ramp or hauling track through which the slabs could have been moved. Specific hypotheses involving sliding and counterweight mechanisms have been published. None has been confirmed through direct evidence, and the spatial constraints involved in maneuvering slabs weighing up to 80 tons through the available interior passages remain a challenge that experimental reconstruction has not yet fully addressed. The survey precision of the pyramid's exterior adds a second area of unresolved detail. The base of the Great Pyramid is oriented to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of less than 4 arc minutes, less than 1/15 of a degree. Over a base extending 230 meters on each side, achieving this level of north-south orientation requires a surveying method of considerable accuracy. Several methods have been proposed, including the use of stellar alignments, specifically the circumpolar stars, which trace circles around the celestial pole and whose midpoints can be used to determine true north with high precision. Practical tests have shown that this technique can achieve the required accuracy given clear skies and patient observation. Whether it is the actual method used at Giza remains inferential because no contemporary document describing the survey process has been found. The leveling of the base is equally remarkable. Across the entire 53,000 square meter footprint, the base of the Great Pyramid is level to within approximately 2 centimeters, an extraordinary achievement over that distance, given that any error at one end of the base would propagate through the entire structure. Water channel leveling has been proposed as the most likely method, and it is consistent with what we know of Egyptian hydraulic knowledge. Again, no direct documentary confirmation exists. One area of ongoing active research involves the interior spaces of the pyramid that have not yet been directly explored. In recent years, muon tomography, a technique that uses cosmic ray muons to image the interior of large solid objects in a way analogous to X-rays, has detected evidence of one or more large voids within the Great Pyramid that do not correspond to any known chamber or corridor. The nature of these voids, whether they represent additional chambers, construction gaps, or some other structural feature, remains under investigation. They serve as a reminder that even the most studied ancient structure in the world may still contain physical evidence that bears on our understanding of how it was built. The Great Pyramid is not a mystery in the sense of being inexplicable. It is a mystery in the more precise sense that the specific methods behind its most technically demanding features, the installation sequence for the granite chambers, the survey methods used to achieve its extraordinary precision, the logistics of the upper courses, where conventional ramp theories face mounting spatial challenges, have not been confirmed through direct evidence. Every year of research adds to the picture. The picture is not yet complete. The ramp question deserves more specific attention than it typically receives in popular accounts. Researchers have proposed various ramp configurations for getting blocks to the upper levels of the pyramid as it grew in height. A single straight ramp extending outward from one face, a series of ramps wrapping around the 4 sides in a spiral arrangement, or a combination of internal and external ramps whose geometry changed at different construction phases. Each configuration has structural problems. A straight external ramp long enough to reach the pyramid's upper courses would have required more material than the pyramid itself. A spiral ramp would have obscured the corners needed for alignment checks. Internal ramps would have required later removal, leaving no clear trace. Each hypothesis resolves some constraints while creating others, and no consensus has emerged. What we can observe with confidence is that the upper courses of the pyramid show evidence of careful planning and quality control comparable to the lower ones. The stones are well dressed and accurately placed, even as they narrow toward the apex. Whatever method was used to reach those heights, it worked. The specific nature of that method, the exact geometry of any ramp system, the equipment used to lift and position blocks at the final heights, is something the physical evidence has not yet revealed definitively. For a monument as thoroughly studied as the Great Pyramid, that gap is both surprising and instructive about the limits of even intensive archaeological investigation. It is also worth noting what the Great Pyramid tells us about the relationship between ambition and organization in the ancient world. Whatever the specific construction methods, the achievement of completing a structure of this scale within a single royal reign, approximately 23 years, required not just technical capability, but an institutional structure of extraordinary efficiency. The supply chains, the workforce management, the quality control at every level of production, the coordination of material flows from quarry sites hundreds of kilometers away, all of these had to function reliably, simultaneously, and at sustained pace for decades. The organizational intelligence embedded in the pyramid's construction is as impressive as the engineering intelligence embedded in its design, and like the engineering, it is something we understand in outline but have not yet fully reconstructed in detail. On a bare, wind-exposed hilltop in the Harran Plain of southeastern Turkey, there is a place that has quietly rewritten the textbook of human prehistory. Not by providing new answers to old questions, but by forcing the questions themselves to be reformulated from the ground up. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, in Turkish, roughly pot-bellied hill, and the story of its discovery is almost as remarkable as what it contains. A Kurdish shepherd named Savak Yildiz, walking his flock across the stony hillside near the town of Şanlıurfa in 1994, noticed that some of the limestone slabs protruding from the ground had an unusually regular appearance. They were not random rock outcrops. When the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt examined them shortly afterward, he immediately recognized that he was looking at worked stone, deliberately shaped slabs of a kind associated with prehistoric construction. When excavation began, what emerged went far beyond anything the team had expected to find. Beneath the surface of that wind-scoured hillside were circular enclosures, each containing multiple large T-shaped stone pillars arranged in a deliberate pattern, the largest in the center, others around the perimeter, connected by stone walls and low benches. The pillars were not simple standing stones, they were carved. Their surfaces bore elaborate relief sculptures of animals in extraordinary variety: foxes with bared teeth, boars, cranes in flight, bulls, snakes, spiders, scorpions, vultures, and other creatures rendered with a naturalistic quality that speaks to close, sustained observation of the living world. Some pillars bore abstract symbols, hands, belts, loincloths, suggesting that the T-shape itself may have represented stylized human figures rather than purely geometric forms. The quality of the carving is high by any standard. The reliefs show confident, practiced hands capable of working stone at a fine scale with precision and artistic intentionality. This was not the work of people making their first experiments with the medium. It was the product of a mature craft tradition, one that presumably extended back through generations of practice. The dating of the site is what makes everything about it so significant. The oldest and deepest enclosures at Göbekli Tepe have been securely dated by radiocarbon analysis to approximately 11,600 to 12,000 years before the present. That places their construction at the very end of the last ice age, in the epoch archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic, a period that, until Göbekli Tepe's discovery, was generally understood as a time of small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers living at subsistence level, capable of impressive cave art and sophisticated flint knapping, but not yet organized enough to undertake large-scale construction projects. Göbekli Tepe predates the first confirmed evidence of agriculture in the region by several centuries. It predates pottery. It predates the wheel. It predates the first cities of Mesopotamia by more than 6,000 years. By the time Stonehenge was being assembled in southern England, Göbekli Tepe had already been buried for 6,000 years. The challenge this poses to established narratives is direct and profound. Conventional archaeological models held that large-scale collective construction, the kind that requires sustained coordination of labor across an extended period, was a product of the agricultural revolution. The theory was intuitive. Only after the development of farming, which allowed for food surpluses and the emergence of hierarchical social structures with the power to organize and direct large workforces, could truly monumental construction appear. Göbekli Tepe predates all of that. It was built by people who, as far as we can tell from the available evidence, were still primarily hunting and gathering. One of the most productive scholarly responses to this apparent paradox involves inverting the causal relationship. Rather than agriculture giving rise to the conditions for monument building, perhaps monument building itself created the need for agriculture. The logic runs as follows. Göbekli Tepe required large numbers of people to converge at one location for extended periods. Feeding those gatherings demanded a consistent, reliable food supply that wild game and foraged plants alone could not guarantee. The pressure to reliably feed large congregations may have driven the deliberate cultivation and eventually the domestication of wild grain species in the region. Genetic analysis of wild and domesticated wheat varieties suggests that the earliest domestication events occurred in exactly the region around Göbekli Tepe. This hypothesis remains speculative, but has attracted substantial scholarly interest. The purpose of the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe is another area of active debate. The complete absence of domestic refuse, cooking remains, storage facilities, middens, indicates that the site was not permanently inhabited. It was visited, used for purposes that involved large gatherings, and left between those events. The most widely accepted interpretation is that Göbekli Tepe was a ritual or ceremonial gathering place, possibly associated with shamanistic practices, ancestor veneration, or the coordination of otherwise dispersed regional populations around shared symbolic and spiritual traditions. The animal imagery on the pillars has been analyzed as possibly representing clan or group totems, or as embodiments of supernatural forces associated with the landscape and seasons. One of the most puzzling aspects of Göbekli Tepe is what its builders eventually did with it. The enclosures were not abandoned and left to decay. They were deliberately backfilled, buried under thousands of tons of rubble, flint tools, and animal bones, in a process that appears to have been intentional and organized. The burial was so thorough that it effectively preserved the site, sealing it from weathering in a way that allowed Schmidt's team to find it essentially intact beneath the surface millennia later. But why a culture would invest the enormous effort required to construct these enclosures and then deliberately entomb them, rather than continuing to use them, modifying them, or simply walking away, is a question that no current scholarly explanation has addressed convincingly. Less than 5% of the full site has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar surveys suggest the presence of many additional enclosures beneath the surrounding hillsides, potentially extending the complex far beyond what has currently been uncovered. Each new excavation season at Göbekli Tepe has produced surprises. The site continues to challenge, revise, and deepen our understanding of what humanity was capable of and when. One of the broader implications of Göbekli Tepe for the study of ancient construction has been somewhat underemphasized in popular coverage. The site does not merely push back the timeline of monumental building, it demonstrates that the social and cognitive prerequisites for complex construction were present in human societies much earlier than previously assumed. If hunter-gatherers 12,000 years ago could organize the quarrying, transport, and precise erection of multi-ton carved limestone pillars at a site that drew participants from a wide surrounding region, then the conventional story of a gradual progression from simple to complex, from primitive to sophisticated, needs significant qualification. The capacity for organized complexity was not invented with agriculture. It was apparently already present, waiting in some sense for the right cultural context to express itself in permanent stone. The question of what specific knowledge tradition enabled the builders of Göbekli Tepe to achieve what they achieved, how they selected the site, how they organized the labor, how they transmitted the architectural vision from one generation to the next across the extended construction period, is one that the physical evidence alone cannot fully answer. The site offers us the results of that knowledge. It does not offer us the knowledge itself. In the broad agricultural valley known as the Bekaa, cradled between the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountain ranges, there is a site that has been considered sacred for so long that its earliest history has been almost entirely submerged beneath subsequent layers of occupation, worship, and construction. The modern visitor to Baalbek in eastern Lebanon encounters first the spectacular ruins of a Roman temple complex, the Temple of Jupiter, whose surviving columns are among the tallest ancient columns still standing anywhere in the world, and the more intimate Temple of Bacchus, one of the best preserved Roman temples in existence. These structures are extraordinary in their own right, but it is what lies beneath them and around them that raises the most persistent and unanswered questions. The temples of Baalbek were built on a large artificial platform known as the Grand Terrace, constructed from massive stone blocks as a foundation for the religious complex above. The Romans were themselves prodigious builders and regularly worked with large stones. But even by Roman standards, certain elements of the Baalbek platform are exceptional. Incorporated into the western retaining wall of the terrace is a course of stones known as the trilithon. 3 individual limestone blocks positioned side by side at a height of approximately 8 meters above ground level. Each block is roughly 19 to 21 meters long, 4 meters tall, and approximately 4 meters wide. Their estimated weights range from approximately 800 to over 1,000 metric tons each. These are not exaggerated estimates. They are derived from direct measurement of the block's dimensions, combined with the measured density of the local limestone from which they are cut. The trilithon blocks are genuinely among the largest stones ever incorporated into a human structure anywhere on Earth. To put their scale in perspective, the largest stones at Stonehenge weigh approximately 25 tons. The largest blocks in the Pyramid of Khufu weigh approximately 60 to 80 tons. The trilithon blocks at Baalbek are 10 to 15 times heavier than the heaviest pyramid blocks and 30 to 40 times heavier than the heaviest Stonehenge stones. The Romans who built the temple above clearly incorporated the trilithon into their construction. The platform was already present when Roman construction began, and the temples were built to take advantage of the existing large foundation. Roman writers and architects who documented their own engineering achievements with considerable pride and thoroughness do not describe constructing the trilithon. The most natural interpretation of this absence is that the Romans found it already there and treated it as pre-existing infrastructure. But who built it, when and why remains a matter of genuine scholarly debate. Proposed builders include the Phoenicians, who occupied the region before the Romans and were known as accomplished builders, earlier Canaanite or Bronze Age cultures, or a Roman construction phase that predated the better documented later temples. Each attribution has supporters and difficulties. The logistical challenge of the trilithon is not theoretical. Moving an 800-ton block of stone from a quarry to a construction site, lifting it to a height of 8 meters, and setting it in precise position next to its neighbors represents an engineering problem that is not solved by pointing to historical examples of large block construction elsewhere, because nothing comparable in mass appears elsewhere in the ancient record. The principles of large block movement, rollers, sledges, earthen ramps, large workforces, are well established. Their application to masses an order of magnitude greater than anything else in ancient construction involves challenges of ground preparation, structural integrity of the moving apparatus, and coordinated human or animal effort that have not been fully worked out through experimental reconstruction. Scholars who argue that the Romans built the trilithon point to Roman engineering achievements of comparable ambition in other contexts, and to the presence of Roman construction techniques in the stonework. Those who argue for pre-Roman origins point to stylistic evidence and to the logical puzzle of why Roman builders would set such massive stones at foundation level when equally effective platform construction could have been achieved with smaller blocks, as was done everywhere else the Romans built. The debate has not been resolved by any finding that all parties accept. Approximately 900 meters from the Baalbek complex in the ancient limestone quarry from which the platform stones were extracted, an enormous block lies where it was apparently abandoned mid-preparation. Known locally as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, it is estimated to weigh between 1,000 and 1,200 metric tons, larger than the trilithon blocks and the largest known dressed stone in the ancient world. The block was clearly being prepared for transport. Its underside has been shaped, and cuts along its edge suggest the beginning of the separation process. Why it was abandoned in the quarry is unknown. It may have developed a crack that made it unsuitable for use. It may have been intended for a phase of construction that was never completed. Or its preparation may have been a demonstration of capacity rather than a practical construction step. Below the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, archaeological excavation in 2014 revealed a second, even larger block, estimated at approximately 1,750 metric tons, partially exposed in the quarry floor. This block had not previously been recognized because it was still partially buried. Its discovery added another layer to the Baalbek puzzle. If blocks of this size were being prepared, what structure were they intended for? And how did anyone, using any technology we can reconstruct from this period, plan to move and position them? The Baalbek platform remains one of the most technically challenging ancient construction achievements to explain. The sheer mass of the stones involved pushes beyond what any conventional reconstruction of ancient building methods has successfully demonstrated. The historical record around the platform's construction is silent in ways that are difficult to account for. And the blocks themselves, still in position after 2 millennia, still waiting to be fully explained, represent one of the ancient world's most tangible and persistent engineering enigmas. What makes the Baalbek situation particularly interesting from a scholarly perspective is the way it highlights the difference between proof of possibility and proof of method. Researchers who argue that ancient builders could have moved the trilithon blocks are almost certainly correct. If the blocks are in place, then clearly something moved them, and human effort combined with appropriate mechanical advantage is the only realistic explanation. But demonstrating that something is physically possible in principle is different from demonstrating exactly how it was done. The gap between those two things, between this could have been achieved and this is how it was achieved specifically, is where the genuine archaeological question lives. And at Baalbek, that gap remains wider than almost anywhere else in the ancient world. The silence of the documentary record is itself a clue, though it points in multiple possible directions. It might indicate that the trilithon is genuinely pre-Roman, built by a culture that had less interest in written records or whose records have been entirely lost. It might indicate that the Romans considered the existing platform so obviously impressive that no description seemed necessary, a kind of ancient equivalent of neglecting to document something because it is assumed to be already known. Or it might indicate something else entirely, some aspect of the Baalbek platform's history that current scholarship has not yet identified. The silence, ultimately, is not an answer. It is another question. We stand now at the midpoint of this documentary, having moved from the Andes to East Africa's ancient calendar sites, from the temples of pre-dynastic Egypt to the jungles of Central America, from the Altiplano of Bolivia to the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon. And the question that opened this investigation, what did ancient builders know and how did they know it, has not grown simpler. It has grown more layered. Because what the evidence across these sites suggests is not a single knowledge tradition passed from culture to culture, but something more distributed and more remarkable, a repeated, independent convergence on similar principles achieved through different means by different peoples in response to similar human impulses toward permanence, precision, and the encoding of knowledge into enduring stone. That convergence is the real mystery, not any single site, but the pattern across all of them. What becomes particularly striking at this midpoint is the way each site we have visited has contributed a different piece to a larger mosaic. Puma Punku offers the puzzle of extreme precision in hard stone without a confirmed tool capable of producing it. Sacsay Huaman demonstrates that polygonal masonry at the larger scale can achieve seismic performance that has not been surpassed. The Great Pyramid presents the challenge of an organizational and engineering achievement whose specific methods have been studied for centuries without final resolution. Göbekli Tepe overturns the assumed sequence of social development entirely. And Baalbek confronts us with the logistical question of how the heaviest known ancient building stones were moved and positioned without any surviving account of the process. Together, these 5 sites have established that the questions we are asking are not marginal or easily dismissed. They are central to our understanding of what the ancient world was. The 5 sites ahead will deepen that understanding and deepen the questions along with it. In the autumn of 1992, a man named Wu Anai in the village of Xianbeikun in Zhejiang province in eastern China decided to investigate something that had always puzzled the local community. The area around the village was dotted with small ponds, some natural, some seemingly artificial, that no one could account for in the local historical memory. Wu acquired a water pump, positioned it at the edge of one of the ponds, and began draining it. What he found when the water level dropped far enough to reveal the pond's bottom left the village stunned. Beneath the water was not pond bed. It was a ceiling. The pond was the flooded entrance to an enormous artificial cavern, its roof just below the water surface. As more water was pumped out, the full dimensions of the space became apparent. A chamber of cathedral proportions, with a ceiling height of approximately 30 meters in the deepest sections, floor area measuring in the hundreds of square meters, and walls and ceiling covered in a uniform, precisely executed pattern of parallel diagonal chisel marks extending across every surface without interruption. Further investigation revealed that the surrounding landscape held more than 30 similar ponds, each concealing a comparable cavern. When the largest of these, now known as Cave Number 1, was fully drained and examined, it measured approximately 28 meters from entrance to back wall, with a maximum width of approximately 22 meters. The total floor area of all known Longyou caves combined amounts to roughly 30,000 square meters. Excavating that volume of sandstone would have required removing approximately 1 million cubic meters of material and disposing of it, or using it, somewhere in the surrounding landscape. The Longyou caves are carved from soft sandstone, which is relatively easy to work compared to granite or basalt. Their construction would have required sustained, organized effort rather than technically extraordinary tools or techniques. Standard metal chisels, iron tools of the kind available in China for well over 2,000 years, could have done the work. The physical challenge of carving 30-plus large caves from bedrock is formidable but not mysterious in principle. What is mysterious about the Longyou caves is the combination of their scale and their invisibility to history. Ancient China was one of the best documented civilizations of the ancient world. The bureaucratic apparatus of successive Chinese dynasties generated administrative records, tax rolls, labor accounts, imperial chronicles, and literary traditions covering an enormous range of human activity. A construction project requiring the removal of 1 million cubic meters of stone, equivalent to an undertaking larger than many Egyptian pyramid projects, would ordinarily leave a trace in that documentary landscape. An administrative decree authorizing the work, a record of the workers involved, a reference in a regional chronicle. Some mention, however brief, in the vast textual archive of Chinese history. None has been found. No ancient Chinese text has been identified that unambiguously describes the construction or purpose of the Longyou caves. Artifacts found within the caves, pottery sherds and ceramic fragments, have been dated to somewhere between the Qin dynasty, 291 to 206 BCE, and the Han dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, providing a rough construction window of roughly 2,000 years ago. But the absence of any corroborating historical record for a project of this scale is unusual to the point of being inexplicable by ordinary means. Either the relevant records were lost in one of China's periodic episodes of document destruction, or the project was conducted outside official channels in a way that left no administrative trace, or the dating is incorrect, and the caves are significantly older than current estimates suggest. The chiseling pattern that covers every surface of the Longyou caves is one of the site's most striking features. The marks are not random. They are parallel, diagonal, consistently spaced, and applied at a consistent angle across the entire surface of every wall, ceiling, and floor in every cave. The uniformity is extraordinary. Whether you are examining a section of ceiling near the entrance of Cave Number 1 or a floor area deep within Cave Number 4, the pattern is the same. This implies either a single consistent method enforced rigorously across the entire workforce, or the use of a standardized tool used in a standardized way by every individual worker, a level of procedural consistency that implies careful supervision and quality control. Researchers have proposed various functional explanations for the chisel pattern. One is purely technical. The marks are the natural result of the specific tool used, a flat chisel swung at a consistent angle, and their uniformity is an automatic consequence of standardized tooling rather than a deliberate aesthetic choice. Another suggestion is that the rough surface created by the chiseling serves a structural purpose, increasing the surface area of the stone walls and thereby improving friction between the rock layers in ways that reduce the risk of spalling. A third interpretation treats the pattern as deliberately decorative, an assertion of control over the space, a cultural claim to the underground environment expressed through imposed geometric order. None of these explanations has been confirmed, partly because the cultural context of the caves remains so poorly understood. Without knowing who built them, when, and for what purpose, it is difficult to evaluate whether the marking pattern served a structural, procedural, or cultural function, or some combination of all three. What can be said is that whoever organized the excavation of the Longyou caves did so with remarkable consistency, remarkable organizational control, and remarkable thoroughness, and then apparently disappeared from the historical record without a trace. The disposal question is worth lingering on. 1 million cubic meters of excavated sandstone had to go somewhere. That volume of material, if deposited in a single location, would form a mound visible from some distance. Geological surveys of the surrounding landscape have not identified obvious spoil heaps of the scale that would be expected. Some researchers have suggested the material was used in construction or embankment works in the area, effectively dispersing it across a wider landscape in a way that would make it difficult to identify millennia later. Others have proposed that the caves were excavated over such an extended period that the material was disposed of gradually, in ways that left no concentrated archaeological signature. Neither explanation has been confirmed through direct evidence. The Longyou caves also raise a question about the relationship between ancient underground construction and the uses to which such spaces were put. Underground environments have specific properties: stable temperature, consistent humidity, isolation from weather and noise, acoustic distinctiveness, that make them suitable for certain purposes and unsuitable for others. Storage of grain, preservation of valuables, protection of people or goods during conflict, ceremonial use that benefits from separation from the ordinary surface world, all of these have been proposed for the Longyou caves. The lack of identifying artifacts within the caves beyond the dating ceramics makes it impossible to choose confidently between these options. The caves were found essentially empty, used apparently, and then cleared, leaving only their architecture behind as evidence of their existence and perhaps their purpose. Malta is the smallest country in the European Union, 2 small islands at the center of the Mediterranean, covering a total area of about 316 square kilometers. It is a place of ancient history on an almost impossible scale. Within those few square kilometers, the density of prehistoric monuments is greater than almost anywhere else on Earth, and buried beneath the streets of the town of Paola, on the larger of the 2 islands, is a structure that manages to be simultaneously the oldest, the most technically impressive, and the most acoustically extraordinary prehistoric monument in the Mediterranean world. The Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni, the word hypogeum comes from the Greek for underground, is a subterranean complex of chambers, corridors, carved niches and open spaces cut into the soft Globigerina limestone that underlies most of Malta. It was discovered in 1902 when workers quarrying foundations for new housing broke through the ceiling of one of its upper chambers. Archaeological investigation subsequently revealed a 3-level underground complex extending to approximately 11 meters below the surface, covering a total floor area of roughly 500 square meters, with dozens of individual carved spaces connected by passages and doorways. The construction of the Hypogeum appears to have begun around 3600 BCE and continued in phases through approximately 2500 BCE, a span of over 1,000 years during which the space was progressively deepened, expanded, and elaborated. The people who built it belonged to the Maltese temple-building culture, the same civilization responsible for the surface megalithic temples at Gantija, Hagarkim, Menajdra, and Tarxian. They worked without metal tools, using stone picks and antler tools to cut the limestone, which is relatively soft when first quarried, but hardens significantly on exposure to air. The quality of the carving in the Hypogeum varies by level. The upper levels, which appear to have been used partly for natural cave adaptation, are rougher. The middle level is the most architecturally refined, and it is here that the builders achieve something that still draws architectural admiration. In the middle level, the spaces are not simply excavated voids. They are carved to deliberately imitate the appearance of above-ground megalithic architecture. Doorways have been carved in the shape of the trilithon openings found in the surface temples. Ceiling surfaces are cut in stepped curves that produce the visual effect of corbelled vaulting. Decorative elements including running spiral patterns painted in red ochre and carved relief details that mirror the architectural vocabulary of the surface buildings create an environment that feels not like a cave but like a building that happens to be underground. The effort required to achieve this in a subterranean context, without the ability to step back and view the work from a distance during construction, without natural light except what was brought in by lamp, and using only stone and antler tools to shape a material that hardens progressively as you work it, is considerable. The spatial reasoning required to carve architectural forms that look coherent from the inside, when you can only view small sections of them at a time, implies a mental model of the space that extended beyond direct visual access. The hypogeum served as a communal burial site over its long period of use. The remains of approximately 7,000 individuals were found within its chambers, along with grave goods including pottery, figurines, and objects of personal adornment. Some of the figurines are among the most remarkable examples of prehistoric art in the Mediterranean, in particular the so-called Sleeping Lady figurine, found at the site and now housed in the National Museum of Archaeology in Valletta. She depicts a reclining female figure, apparently asleep or in a trance, with elaborate detail in the rendering of her garments and the position of her body. Many researchers interpret her posture as representing ritual incubation, the practice of sleeping within a sacred space to receive divine visions or oracular communication, a custom attested in later Mediterranean cultures at sites like the healing sanctuaries of Asclepios in classical Greece. The acoustic dimension of the hypogeum is the aspect that has attracted the most attention from researchers outside the field of archaeology proper. A small carved chamber on the middle level, called the oracle room, features a small niche cut into one wall at roughly chest height. When a resonant male voice speaks or sings into this niche at frequencies around 110 Hz, a low baritone register, something unusual happens to the sound. It expands. It fills the underground complex in multiple directions simultaneously, reflecting off the carved walls and ceiling in a pattern that creates a pervasive reverberation, seeming to come from everywhere at once, rather than from a specific source. The effect, described by many visitors as extraordinary, has been measured and confirmed by acoustic researchers using calibrated instrumentation. The significance of 110 Hz as a specific resonant frequency has been noted by researchers in archaeoacoustics, the study of acoustic properties in ancient spaces. Studies of other prehistoric structures in Europe, including the Newgrange Passage tomb in Ireland and various megalithic chambers in France and Spain, have found that many of them share this approximate resonant frequency. Research published in the context of neuroscience and environmental psychology has established that sound at around 110 Hz affects human brainwave activity, promoting a shift towards slower alpha and theta wave patterns associated with meditative, trance-like, and altered consciousness states. Whether prehistoric builders were aware of this effect empirically, having experienced it within their existing structures and chosen to replicate or enhance it in new construction, or whether the resonance is a structural coincidence, is a question that archaeologists and acousticians continue to debate. The argument for intentionality at the hypogeum rests on the specific geometry of the oracle room niche, which appears well configured to project sound into the larger space in exactly the manner that produces the strongest resonant effect. The argument against certainty rests on the difficulty of proving intent when the builders left no written record, and the resonance could theoretically have arisen from the space's geometry without anyone deliberately engineering it. What is not debatable is that the effect is real, that it is measurable, and that it occurs within a space that was clearly used for ritual purposes by a culture that was closely attentive to the relationship between physical environment and altered states of consciousness. The physical constraints of the hypogeum's construction add another dimension to the mystery. The builders worked in complete darkness except for the light they brought with them. Oil lamps or torches that would have cast unsteady, localized illumination across surfaces being cut in real time. In that environment, carving architectural details to the standard seen in the middle level, the carefully shaped doorways, the corbelled ceiling forms, the painted spiral decorations, would have required not only technical skill, but an ability to maintain spatial orientation and quality control in conditions that modern workers would find extremely challenging. The builders must have had highly developed mental models of the spaces they were creating, allowing them to work by touch and localized light toward forms they could visualize clearly, even when they could not see the full context of their work. The hypogeum also raises questions about the relationship between underground construction and the cultural meaning of the underground itself. Many ancient cultures associated subterranean spaces with the underworld, with the domain of the dead, with the source of fertility and renewal. The Maltese temple builders who interred their dead in the hypogeum across many generations clearly understood it as a threshold space, a place between the living world above and whatever they believed lay beneath or beyond. The architectural effort invested in making that space beautiful, acoustically resonant, and visually coherent with their above-ground sacred buildings suggests that the underground was not merely a repository, but a fully realized sacred environment, one in which the builders' most sophisticated architectural knowledge was deployed with the same intentionality as in their most important surface constructions. From the Peruvian coast, a traveler heading south through the barren desert lowlands between the Andes and the Pacific Ocean enters one of the driest environments on Earth. The Nazca Plateau, an elevated desert floor strewn with dark, iron-rich pebbles, receives almost no rainfall. Wind speeds are low and consistent, and temperatures fluctuate between extreme heat during the day and sharp cold at night. It is, in terms of long-term preservation, one of the best natural archives on the planet, and it holds, spread across its surface in patterns that become visible only from the air, one of the most ambitious and enigmatic artistic projects of the ancient world. The Nazca lines are a collection of geoglyphs, images created in the desert surface by removing the dark, reddish-brown layer of iron oxide-coated pebbles that covers the plateau, and exposing the pale yellowish-gray subsoil beneath. The contrast between removed and unremoved material creates lines, shapes, and figures that are clearly visible from above. Because the climate is so stable, the wind so gentle, and the rainfall essentially zero, these designs have persisted for between 1,500 and 2,000 years with minimal erosion, preserved by the same environmental conditions that make the plateau so inhospitable to human habitation. The scale and variety of the designs is striking. Some elements are simple straight lines, extending for kilometers across the plateau, with a straightness that puzzles observers even when they know the method by which they were made. Others are geometric forms, large trapezoids covering areas of several hectares, spirals, zigzag patterns, and enclosed rectangular spaces. And then there are the figurative designs that have made the Nazca lines famous. A hummingbird with a wingspan of nearly 100 meters, a condor even larger, a spider whose legs measure dozens of meters across, a monkey with a tightly spiraled tail, a whale, various plant forms, and several humanoid figures, including one on a hillside that appears to raise one hand as if in greeting or warning. The mainstream explanation for who created the lines, the Nazca culture of southern Peru between approximately 200 BCE and 600 CE, is well supported by archaeological evidence and is not seriously disputed. Ceramic remains consistent with the Nazca cultural tradition have been found at the edges of many line sections. The lines and figures are consistent in style and technique with other Nazca artistic traditions, and the methods used to create them are demonstrably achievable with the technology the Nazca possessed. Experimental archaeology has established convincingly that straight lines of the length seen at Nazca can be created using wooden stakes and cords, extended progressively along a predetermined bearing. The figurative designs can be understood as large-scale transfers of smaller sketches using a grid scaling method, a technique with many ancient parallels in which a design drawn on a small grid is transferred to a large surface by scaling each grid square proportionally. No aspect of the construction method requires technology or knowledge beyond what the Nazca demonstrably possessed. Where the questions concentrate is not in the how but in the why. The straight lines, in their most straightforward interpretation, may have served as ritual pathways, routes walked during ceremonial processions, perhaps associated with specific seasonal events, water sources, or the movements of astronomical bodies. Several of the longest lines point in the direction of sunrise or sunset on astronomically significant dates, though the multiplicity of directions represented across the full line system means that some alignments with astronomical events are likely to occur by chance in any large collection of lines oriented across a full 360 degrees. Researchers debate how many of the alignments are intentional and how many are coincidental. The figurative designs present a distinct puzzle. The hummingbird, the spider, the condor, the monkey. These are complete images, comprehensible as unified forms only from an altitude of at least several hundred meters. At ground level, a person standing within or next to one of these figures would see only shallow linear depressions in the pebble surface. The full gestalt of the image, the complete form that makes the hummingbird recognizable as a hummingbird, is simply not available to a ground-level observer. This observation has generated a persistent question. For whom were the figures made? Several interpretations have been proposed. One is that the figures were offerings or messages directed toward sky deities or mountain spirits understood to inhabit the high peaks of the nearby Andes, that the aerial perspective was not a human perspective but a divine one, and the figures were designed to be legible to non-human observers understood to view the world from above. Another interpretation holds that the act of creating the figure, including the act of walking its outline in ritual procession, was the primary purpose, and that the aerial image, while present, was not the functional point of the design. The image was a byproduct of the ritual action, not its objective. A more speculative possibility involves the use of elevated observation points in the surrounding hills and ridges. Several researchers have noted that certain Nazca figures are partially visible from high ground in the surrounding terrain, not in their full aerial form, but in partial views that might have allowed a skilled observer to verify the proportions of a design in progress. Whether this represents active use of elevated viewpoints during construction or simply coincidental partial visibility has not been established. An important recent research thread connects the Nazca lines to the civilization's sophisticated relationship with water. The Nazca built an extensive underground aqueduct system, the Puquios, that tapped into the region's aquifer and distributed water to communities across the dry coastal plain. These aqueducts, some of which are still functional today, represent a sophisticated understanding of groundwater hydrology. Several researchers have proposed a spatial relationship between certain lines and the locations of underground water sources, suggesting that the geoglyph system may have served partly as a surface map of the subsurface hydrology, a guide to where water could be found in a landscape where its surface absence was a constant existential challenge. This hypothesis has not been confirmed through direct evidence, but it has generated serious scholarly attention. The Nazca lines resist a single satisfying explanation because they were almost certainly not made for a single reason. Over several centuries of continuous use, the plateau was marked, remarked, and added to by successive generations who may have understood their own additions differently from how earlier generations understood theirs. The lines are not a singular artifact with a singular purpose, but a layered landscape, accumulated over centuries, whose full meaning may have been as complex and internally varied as the civilization that created it. That complexity makes them no less extraordinary, and no easier to fully explain. Recent scholarship has added further texture to the picture of the Nazca through analysis of their broader cultural and environmental context. The Nazca occupied a coastal desert environment that, despite its natural aridity, was periodically transformed by the El Niño climate cycle, oscillations between extreme drought and catastrophic flooding that could devastate agricultural systems and force rapid adaptation. The enormous investment in the Puquio aqueduct system and the possibility of a spatial relationship between the lines and water sources suggests a civilization that organized significant cultural and ritual energy around the problem of water. In this context, The geoglyphs might be understood not merely as art or ceremony, but as an expression of a society's deepest existential preoccupation, inscribed at vast scale in the most durable medium available. The desert itself became the canvas for a cultural response to the most pressing challenge of life in that landscape. What the Nazca lines ultimately represent, across all the layers of meaning they accumulated over centuries of use, from ritual pathways to cosmological maps to hydrological guides to expressions of chiefly power, is something that resists reduction to any single frame. They are too large, too old, too varied, and too insufficiently documented to yield completely to any current interpretation. They remain in the deepest sense a living question inscribed on the Earth's surface, patient, enduring, and still waiting for us to understand them fully. There is one aspect of the Nazca lines that tends to get lost in discussions focused primarily on the largest and most dramatic figures: the sheer number and variety of the elements that make up the full geoglyph system. Alongside the famous hummingbird and condor are hundreds of simpler lines, dozens of trapezoids of varying dimensions, multiple spirals, and numerous smaller animal figures that are less frequently reproduced but no less carefully made. The system as a whole is not the work of a brief period of intense activity. It is the accumulated product of a civilization's centuries-long engagement with its desert landscape, an engagement that took different forms in different periods, served different purposes for different communities and generations, and produced a record that is, in its full complexity, far richer and more layered than any single interpretive framework can adequately capture. The famous figures are the most visible entry points into that record. They are not its full extent. For the final investigation in this documentary, we do not travel to a single location. We pull back, far enough back to see not just one site, but the pattern that emerges when all 10 of them are held in view simultaneously. That pattern is not a proof of anything. It is something more empirical and in some ways more unsettling, a collection of observations about what ancient builders independently achieved across cultures and continents that together make the central question of this documentary unavoidable. We begin, for this final section, with the megalithic temples of Malta, because they are, in terms of dated age, the oldest chapter in the story of human monumental construction. The temples of Gantija, Hagarkim, Mnajdra, Skorba, Tarxien, and several others were built on the Maltese islands between approximately 3600 and 2500 BCE. Radiocarbon dating of organic material found within and beneath them has been confirmed multiple times by independent laboratory analysis. The dates are reliable, and they are significant because they place the construction of the Maltese temples before the completion of Stonehenge in its final form, before the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, and before the majority of the recognized monumental structures of the ancient world. The builders of the Maltese temples are known primarily through what they left behind, because they left no writing. They were a people who inhabited 2 small Mediterranean islands for over 1,000 years, constructing increasingly sophisticated stone buildings, developing a distinctive artistic tradition that included some of the most remarkable prehistoric sculpture in Europe, conducting elaborate burial practices in sites like the Hypogeum we examined earlier, and then, around 2500 BCE, disappearing from the archaeological record entirely. Their settlement sites were eventually reoccupied by new arrivals with different material culture, different burial practices, and no apparent continuation of the temple-building tradition. What happened to the original inhabitants is unknown. Disease, climate change, migration, conflict, all have been proposed. None has been confirmed. The temples themselves are built from 2 types of local limestone, shaped into large blocks and arranged in a distinctive curved plan. A series of semicircular apses opening off a central axis that is consistent across all major temple sites. The largest blocks used at Gantija, the oldest of the standing temples, weigh over 50 tons. The walls at several temples still stand to heights of 5 to 6 meters, This level of preservation, after 5,000 years of Mediterranean weather, speaks to the quality of the original construction and the care with which the builders selected and shaped their stone. The construction of the Maltese temples presents its own technical puzzles. The islands have no wheeled vehicles or large draft animals in the prehistoric period. The relevant fauna simply was not present. Large stones would have been moved using human labor alone, with wooden rollers, sledges, and ropes. The local topography is hilly, and several temples are situated on hilltops or in positions that required moving large stones uphill. The workforce available on two small islands, even with an optimistic population estimate, was not enormous. And yet the temples were built, rebuilt, and elaborated over more than a millennium, representing a sustained commitment of a small island community to monumental construction that is unusual even by the standards of the ancient world. What is particularly significant about the Maltese temples in the context of this broader investigation is what they reveal about the astronomical knowledge of their builders. Several temples are oriented with precision to capture sunlight at specific moments of the year. At Menajdra, the lower temple is aligned so that at dawn on the spring and autumn equinoxes, sunlight enters through the main doorway and illuminates the altar at the far end of the central corridor. At the solstices, the light falls instead on the edges of the doorway stones, creating a different visual effect. At Hagar Kim, a separate alignment captures the first light of the summer solstice sunrise through a specific aperture, creating a precisely defined beam that moves across a carved stone surface in a way that some researchers believe may have served a calendar function. The deliberate orientation of structures to astronomical events is a feature we have encountered in various forms at several sites in this documentary. The Great Pyramid's extraordinary cardinal alignment, the solstice alignments proposed for certain Nazca lines, the astronomical interpretations offered for some Costa Rican sphere arrangements. The question of whether these represent an independent convergence on a common human practice of using architecture to mark the calendar, which is plausible since astronomical observation serves obvious practical functions in agricultural and pastoral societies, or whether they reflect some degree of shared or transmitted knowledge, is one that scholars debate without resolution. The deepest implication of that convergence across the 10 sites in this documentary is not about any single construction technique. It is about the depth and sophistication of the knowledge traditions that ancient builders sustained across generations. Every extraordinary stone structure we have examined required, at minimum, a mastery of practical geometry, an understanding of material properties, an ability to organize large-scale human effort, and a capacity to transmit complex technical knowledge from one generation to the next without the benefit of written documentation. In some cases, the acoustic resonance of the hypogeum, the seismic performance of Inca polygonal masonry, the astronomical alignments of the Maltese temples, the knowledge encoded in the structures goes beyond basic construction and into territory that implies a sustained empirical engagement with the physical world that we are still in the process of fully appreciating. Consider what it means for a culture to develop, over generations, an understanding of how stone responds to seismic loading, not through mathematical analysis, but through building things, watching what survives and what fails, and gradually refining the approach toward a method that, it turns out, outperforms anything built in the same region for the next 500 years. Consider what it means for a prehistoric people on a small Mediterranean island to observe the movements of the sun carefully enough, over years and decades, to orient a stone building so that sunrise on the equinox illuminates a specific surface at the far end of a 60-meter interior. These are not accidents. They are the products of systematic, sustained, multi-generational attention to the world, a kind of knowledge-making that leaves traces in stone even when the records of its development have been entirely lost. And that perhaps is the most important thing that the 10 sites in this documentary share. They are all physical embodiments of knowledge traditions that were sophisticated, deep, and functionally effective. Traditions that solved real problems of construction, orientation, acoustics, and material science in ways that continue to be studied and admired by specialists in those fields today. The fact that we cannot always reconstruct the specific methods of those traditions because they were carried in the hands and the practice of craftspeople, not in texts, is a reminder of how much knowledge exists without record and how much of the ancient world's intellectual and technical heritage has been irreversibly lost to time. What remains is the stone, and the stone is remarkable enough to tell us that the knowledge which shaped it was remarkable too, even when, perhaps especially when, we cannot yet fully describe what that knowledge was. The Maltese temple culture's sudden disappearance around 2500 BCE adds a poignant dimension to everything we have observed in this mystery. A civilization that sustained over 1,000 years of sophisticated stone construction, astronomical observation, and artistic achievement on two small islands simply ended, not gradually, not in decline, but in a relatively abrupt break that left the temples standing and the questions unanswerable. Whatever caused that end, and theories range from epidemic disease to environmental stress to violent displacement, it took with it the entirety of the living knowledge tradition that the buildings represent. The structures remained. The understanding of how and why they were built did not. That pattern of preservation without explanation, the endurance of the results separated from the knowledge of the process, is, in miniature, the story of every site in this documentary. Sacsayhuaman stands while the techniques that produced its joints remain partially reconstructed. The Longyu caves persist while the administrative records of their construction have vanished. The Nazca figures endure while the precise cultural logic of their creation remains debated. The Great Pyramid rises while the ramp configuration that allowed its construction is still unconfirmed. And Göbekli Tepe waits, largely unexcavated, its oldest and deepest enclosures still sealed beneath the deliberate fill its builders placed over them 12,000 years ago. In each case, the stone outlasted the knowledge. The achievement survived. The tradition that produced it did not. We began this documentary with a question about knowledge, about what ancient builders knew and how they knew it. We have now traveled through 10 sites across multiple continents, spanning more than 12,000 years of human construction history, and the question has not simplified. If anything, it has opened further, not because the sites are inexplicable, but because the more carefully they are examined, the more clearly they demonstrate that the people who built them possessed forms of knowledge, practical, observational, organizational, empirical, that we have not yet fully recovered or described. This is not a conclusion that sits comfortably with either of the two most popular approaches to ancient mysteries. It does not support the dramatic framing that treats every unexplained feature as evidence of lost super-civilizations, advanced technology, or extraterrestrial assistance. The evidence does not point in those directions. What it points toward is something at once more mundane and more genuinely surprising, that the human capacity for careful observation, systematic experimentation, organized knowledge transmission, and sustained collective effort across generations can produce results that are, by any reasonable standard of judgment, extraordinary, and that we have repeatedly underestimated that capacity when assessing what ancient people could have achieved. But neither does the evidence support the equally popular dismissal that waves away every genuine puzzle with references to large labor forces and basic tools, as if the organizational and technical challenges of the most extraordinary ancient constructions were self-evidently simple. They were not. The specific details of how the trilithon blocks of Baalbek were moved, how the granite ceiling slabs of the king's chamber were installed, how the interior angles of Pumapunku's andesite blocks were cut so precisely, how the Longyu cave excavation was organized without leaving any historical trace. These are not questions that have been fully answered, even if they are questions that do not require exotic solutions. Archaeology, at its best, is a discipline of honest uncertainty. It builds the most coherent picture possible from incomplete evidence, tests that picture against new data as it emerges, and revises conclusions when the evidence demands it. The picture of the ancient world that this process has built is one of enormous accomplishment and enormous diversity, of cultures that solved the problems of their environments with ingenuity and discipline, that encoded their understanding of the world into their most permanent creations. and that deserve to be understood on their own terms rather than measured against either a fantasy of lost perfection or a condescension about primitive limitation. What we have examined in this documentary, Pumapunku, the Costa Rican spheres, Sacsayhuaman, the Great Pyramid, Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, the Longyu Caves, the Hippogium, the Nazca Lines, and the Maltese Temple network, represents only a fraction of the global inventory of extraordinary ancient construction. Sites not examined here include the megalithic traditions of Northern Europe, the vast hydraulic engineering of Angkor Wat, the precisely oriented temple complexes of the Maya and Aztec, the enormous earthwork mounds of North America, the megalithic traditions of sub-Saharan Africa, and dozens of other sites that raise comparable questions in their own right. The 10 sites in this documentary are windows into a much larger picture, one that encompasses virtually every inhabited region of the ancient world. That picture is not a picture of uniformity. The cultures that built these structures were profoundly different from each other. Different languages, different religions, different social structures, different relationships to the landscape. They were not connected by some hidden network of shared knowledge, as certain popular theories suggest. They were connected by something more universal, the basic human capacity for sustained, organized, intelligent engagement with the physical world. And they exercised that capacity in different ways, across different challenges, producing different results, while independently arriving at levels of achievement that their successors have often found difficult to match. Perhaps the most instructive thing about the ancient megalithic record, viewed as a whole, is what it suggests about the relationship between knowledge and record-keeping. Most of what these builders knew was never written down because most of them had no writing. The knowledge existed in the trained hands of craftspeople, in the practiced eyes of surveyors, in the accumulated experience of foremen who had managed large construction sites through multiple seasons, in the oral traditions of communities that valued and transmitted what their predecessors had learned. It was living knowledge, knowledge that existed in the doing of things, not in the recording of them. And when the doing stopped, the knowledge vanished. The structures themselves are what remain, mute, permanent, and precisely informative about results, while being largely silent about processes. The stones tell us what was achieved. They do not, in most cases, tell us how. Filling the gap between those two facts is the work that archaeology, engineering, experimental reconstruction, and a growing range of scientific techniques have been engaged in for generations, and will continue to be engaged in for generations to come. Because the gap is real, and the gap matters. Understanding what ancient builders knew, in specific, technical, reconstructible detail, is not simply an academic exercise. It is part of the larger project of understanding what humanity has been capable of across the full range of its history. It is part of the project of correcting the systematically underestimated intelligence and sophistication of our predecessors. And it is part of the project of understanding how knowledge works, how it accumulates, how it is transmitted, how it can be lost, and what it leaves behind when it goes. The stones of Pumapunku and Sacsayhuaman, of Baalbek and Giza, of Göbekli Tepe and the Maltese temples and the Nazca Plateau, all of them are messages from a past that is more sophisticated than we have often been willing to credit. The message is encoded in precision, in scale, in the choices of where to build and how to orient and how to fit one stone against another. We have been reading that message for centuries, and we have not yet finished reading it. What remains unread is not a small remainder, it may be the most important part. Consider for a moment what the 10 sites in this documentary share beneath their enormous surface differences. They were all built at the margins of what was technically possible with the materials and organizational resources available to their builders. They all required sustained multi-generational commitment to a construction project whose completion lay beyond any individual lifetime. They all encoded knowledge about geometry, about materials, about astronomy, about acoustics, about the physical behavior of stone under load, in ways that have lasted millennia and still reward careful examination. And they were all in their own cultural and temporal contexts considered important enough to justify the extreme investment of human effort and ingenuity that they represent. That last observation is perhaps the most important one. The ancient world was full of things that were possible, and most of them were never done. What distinguishes the 10 sites in this documentary from the thousands of sites that were not built or were built on a far more modest scale is not primarily a difference in technical capability. It is a difference in cultural priority. Someone, in each of these places, decided that this particular thing was worth doing at this particular scale with this particular standard of quality. Someone organized, motivated, directed, and sustained the effort that produced it. Someone transmitted the knowledge and the vision from one generation to the next through the decades or centuries that some of these projects required. That someone, the individual or collective intelligence behind each of these extraordinary undertakings, is one of the things we have lost most completely. We have the buildings, we have lost the builders, in the deepest sense, the thinking, feeling, deciding people who made the choices that produced what we see. Archaeology has made progress in recovering glimpses of those people, the workers' graffiti inside the Great Pyramid, the tools found in the quarries at Tiwanaku, the pottery left in the Longyu caves, the skeletal remains of the 7,000 people interred in the hypogeum. But the people themselves, their intentions, their understanding of what they were making and why, their relationship to the knowledge they were applying, these remain largely beyond reach. They exist behind the stone, not in it. What we are left with, ultimately, is the obligation of honest inquiry, to look at what these builders achieved without flinching from the genuine difficulty of explaining it, to resist both the temptation to inflate the mystery beyond what the evidence supports and the temptation to deflate it below what intellectual honesty requires, to maintain the kind of open, curious, careful attention to what the evidence actually says and what it does not say, that the best archaeological and engineering scholarship has always exemplified. The ancient world rewards that kind of attention. It has been yielding new information to careful investigators for centuries, and there is no reason to think that process is anywhere near complete. New technologies are transforming what is possible in the study of ancient sites. LiDAR surveys have revealed previously invisible landscape features at sites from Cambodia to Mexico. Ground-penetrating radar has identified buried structures at Stonehenge, the Great Pyramid, and Göbekli Tepe that were not previously known to exist. Isotopic analysis of stone samples can now trace the precise geographic origins of quarried materials with increasing accuracy, clarifying the logistics of ancient construction in ways that visual examination alone cannot achieve. Acoustic measurement tools have made it possible to characterize the resonant properties of ancient spaces and compare them systematically across multiple sites. Each of these technologies has already changed what we know. Each of them has more to reveal. The 10 sites in this documentary are better understood today than they were a generation ago. They will be better understood a generation from now than they are today. The mystery does not disappear as knowledge accumulates. It refines, sharpens, becomes more precisely articulated, and in that refinement, it becomes paradoxically more interesting rather than less. Because what the best current evidence suggests is not that these sites are inexplicable in principle, but that they are more complex, more carefully conceived and more deeply informed by knowledge traditions we have not yet fully recovered than any simple explanation would imply. We owe it to the people who built these structures to ask the questions as carefully and honestly as we can, not to project onto them either the technological fantasies of our own era or the condescension of assumed primitiveness, but to look at what they made, measure it, test it, debate it, and follow the evidence wherever it leads, including into the places where the evidence runs out, and the honest answer is still, we do not yet know. That intellectual honesty, applied to the most extraordinary achievements of the ancient world, is both a form of respect for the builders and the best possible foundation for the continued investigation that these remarkable places deserve. The stones are patient. They have waited this long. And they will wait with the same indifference to our categories and theories and debates for as long as it takes for us to find the right questions. And eventually, perhaps, the answers that the evidence will finally allow. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay safe.